we rent a cottage by the month. A householder can buy a packing case without remark. Then suppose we clear the people out today, get the packing case tonight, and tomorrow I hire a carriage or a cart we can drive ourselves, and take the box, or whatever we get, to Ringwood or Lyndhurst or somewhere. We could label it Specimens. Don't you see? Johnny, I believe I've hit the nail at last.
Well, it sounds more feasible, admitted John.
Of course, we must take assumed names, continued Morris. It would never do to keep our own. What do you say to Masterman itself? It sounds quiet and dignified.
I will not take the name of Masterman, returned his brother. You may, if you like. I shall call myself Vance. The Great Vance. Positively, the last 6 nights. There's some go in a name like that.
Vance? Cried Morris. Do you think we're playing pantomime for our amusement? There was never anybody named Vance who wasn't a music hall singer.
That's the beauty of it, returned John. It gives you some standing at once. You may call yourself Fortescue till all's blue and nobody cares, but to be Vance gives a man a natural nobility.
But there's lots of other theatrical names. Leybourne, Irving, Brough, Toole.
Devil a one will I take, returned his brother. I'm going to have my little lark out of this as well as you.
Very well,
said Morris, who perceived that John was determined to carry his point.
I shall be Robert Vance.
And I shall be George Vance, cried John. The only original George Vance. Rally round the only original. Repairing as well as they were able the disorder of their clothes, the Finsbury brothers returned to Browndean by a circuitous route in quest of luncheon and a suitable cottage. It is not always easy to drop at a moment's notice on a furnished residence in a retired locality, but fortune presently introduced our adventurers to a deaf carpenter, a man rich in cottages of the required description, and unaffectedly eager to supply their wants. The second place they visited, standing as it did about 1.5 miles from any neighbours, caused them to exchange a glance of hope. On a nearer view, the place was not without depressing features. It stood in a marshy-looking hollow of a heath. Tall trees obscured its windows, the thatch visibly rotted on the rafters, and the walls were stained with splashes of an unwholesome green. The rooms were small, the ceilings low, the furniture merely nominal. A strange chill and a haunting smell of damp pervaded the kitchen, and the bedroom boasted only of one bed. Morris, with a view to cheapening the place, remarked on this defect. "Well," returned the man, "if you can't sleep to a bed, you'd better take a villa residence."
"And then," pursued Morris, "there's no water. How do you get your water?"
"We fill that from the spring," replied the carpenter, pointing to a big barrel that stood beside the door. "The spring ain't so very far off, after all, and it's easy brought in buckets. There's a bucket there." Morris nudged his brother as they examined the water butt. It was new, and very solidly constructed for its office. If anything had been wanting to decide them, this eminently practical barrel would have turned the scale. A bargain was promptly struck. The month's rent was paid upon the nail, and about an hour later the Finsbury brothers might have been observed returning to the blighted cottage, having along with them the key which was the symbol of their tenancy, a spirit lamp with which they fondly told themselves they would be able to cook, a pork pie of suitable dimensions, and a quart of the worst whisky in Hampshire. Nor was this all they had effected. Already, under the plea that they were landscape painters, they had hired for dawn on the morrow a light but solid 2-wheeled cart, so that when they entered in their new character, they were able to tell themselves that the back of the business was already broken. John proceeded to get tea, while Morris, foraging about the house, was presently delighted by discovering the lid of the water butt upon the kitchen shelf. Here, then, was the packing case complete. In the absence of straw, the blankets, which he himself at least had not the smallest intention of using for their present purpose, would exactly take the place of packing; and Morris, as the difficulties began to vanish from his path, rose almost to the brink of exultation. There was, however, one difficulty not yet faced, one upon which his whole scheme depended. Would John consent to remain alone in the cottage? He had not yet dared to put the question.
It was with high good humour that the pair sat down to the deal table and proceeded to fall to on the pork pie. Morris retailed the discovery of the lid, and the great Vance was pleased to applaud by beating on the table with his fork in true music hall style. "That's the dodge," he cried. "I always said a water butt was what you wanted for this business."
Of course,
said Morris, thinking this a favourable opportunity to prepare his brother.
of course you must stay on in this place till I give the word. I'll give out that uncle is resting in the New Forest. It would not do for both of us to appear in London. We could never conceal the absence of the old man.
John's jaw dropped. "Oh, come!" he cried. "You can stay in this hole yourself. I won't." The colour came into Morris's cheeks. He saw that he must win his brother at any cost.
You must please remember, Johnny,
he said,
the amount of the tontine. If I succeed, we shall have each 50,000 to place to our bank account. Ah, and nearer 60.
"But if you fail," returned John, "what then? What'll be the colour of our bank account in that case?"
I will pay all expenses,
said Morris, with an inward struggle.
You shall lose nothing.
"Well," said John, with a laugh, "if the X's are yours and half profits mine, I don't mind remaining here for a couple of days."
A couple of days?
cried Morris, who was beginning to get angry, and controlled himself with difficulty.
Why, you'd do more to win £5 on a horse race.
"Perhaps I would," returned the great Vance. "It's the artistic temperament." "This is monstrous," burst out Morris.
I take all the risks, I pay all expenses, I divide profits, and you won't take the slightest pains to help me. It's not decent, it's not honest, it's not even kind.
"But suppose," objected John, who was considerably impressed by his brother's vehemence, "suppose that Uncle Masterman is alive after all, and lives 10 years longer. Must I rot here all that time?"
Of course not,
responded Morris in a more conciliatory tone.
I only ask a month at the outside, and if Uncle Masterman's not dead by that time, you can go abroad.
"Go abroad?" repeated John eagerly. "Why shouldn't I go at once? Tell them that Joseph and I are seeing life in Paris."
Nonsense,
said Morris. "Well, but look here," said John. "It's this house. It's such a pigsty. It's so dreary and damp. You said yourself that it was damp."
Only to the carpenter,
Morris distinguished.
And that was to reduce the rent. But really, you don't know we're in it. I've seen worse.
"And what am I to do?" complained the victim. "How can I entertain a friend?"
My dear Johnny, if you don't think the tontine worth a little trouble, say so, and I'll give the business up.
You're dead certain of the figures, I suppose?" asked John. "Well, send me the Pink 'Un and all the comic papers regularly. I'll face the music." As afternoon drew on, the cottage breathed more thrillingly of its native marsh. A creeping chill inhabited its chambers. The fire smoked, and a shower of rain, coming up from the channel on a slant of wind, tingled on the window panes. At intervals, when the gloom deepened towards despair, Morris would produce the whisky bottle, and at first John welcomed the diversion. Not for long. It has been said that this spirit was the worst in Hampshire. Only those acquainted with the county can appreciate the force of that superlative. And at length even the great Vance, who was no connoisseur, waved the decoction from his lips. The approach of dusk, feebly combated with a single tallow candle, added a touch of tragedy, and John suddenly stopped whistling through his fingers, an art to the practice of which he had been reduced, and bitterly lamented his concessions. "I can't stay here a month," he cried. "No one could. The thing's nonsense, Morris. The parties that lived in the Bastille would rise against a place like this." With admirable affectation of indifference, Morris proposed a game of pitch and toss. To what will not the diplomatist condescend? It was John's favourite game, indeed his only game. He had found all the rest too intellectual, and he played it with equal skill and good fortune. To Morris himself, on the other hand, the whole business was detestable. He was a bad pitcher, he had no luck in tossing, and he was one who suffered torments when he lost. But John was in a dangerous humour, and his brother was prepared for any sacrifice. By 7 o'clock, Morris, with incredible agony, had lost a couple of half crowns. Even with the tontine before his eyes, this was as